Hey folks, and welcome to this home group study for this month as we continue our series through Revelation. And today we're looking at Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 to 11. So we're looking at the church in Smyrna, a place called Smyrna. And so this is the second church that John is addressing in this little section, in the letters to the seven churches. And the church that is in Smyrna is modern-day Izmir, and it's a pretty big city, even back then, a big port city with a large population of Jews that lived there as well. And within this part of Revelation, though, in these letters to the seven churches, Smyrna is actually really unique, and it's worth paying attention to why it is different. Because Jesus tells us that only Smyrna and another church, Philadelphia, which you read about in chapter 3, verses 7 to 13, only Smyrna and Philadelphia are the churches that Jesus doesn't find any faults with. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person in this church was completely 100% holy and perfect. But it's really important to notice that Jesus doesn't have any issues with this church. And this is surprising because what we read about Smyrna should make us think the opposite, because it's a church that doesn't sound impressive at all. It actually sounds that they're a failing church, a church that has a lot of problems. They're facing tribulation, they're facing poverty, and they're facing slander from those who call themselves Jews but who are not in the city. And what's worse is they've got more suffering to come. Some of them are going to go to jail. And we can probably assume that if church members are going to jail, this wouldn't be doing the reputation of the church much good. So with the world's eyes on, they look like a terrible church, but not to Jesus. So one broad thing to notice just straight away is how Jesus evaluates what a healthy church is. And it's not to do with money or good reputation, necessarily. Of course, using resources wisely is a good thing. Of course, serving the people and collaborating with the people in our city for the common good is, again, a good thing. But how much money we have and whether people like us isn't necessarily the mark of genuine faithfulness to Jesus. So that's the big picture. We'll come back to that and think about that in our questions a bit. But drilling into kind of what's at the heart of this little section, there's two bits of application which we should see straight away in verse 10. Firstly, do not fear what you're about to suffer. That's what Jesus is telling this church initially. And then secondly, be faithful unto death. And so what I want to do first is focus on verses 9 and the first half of verse 10. Because if we're honest, they're the most attention-grabbing verses in this little section. Just imagine being in the shoes of those first hearers in that church. It would make your stomach drop to hear John's letter saying this, wouldn't it? Because in verse 9, they're in the middle of suffering already. They're already in tribulation. They're already poor. They're being insulted and ridiculed. And then what's worse is that some of them are going to go to jail. If we knew that was about to happen to us, we would be quaking in our boots, I'm sure. But even in verses 9 and 10, and that first half of verse 10, there is some comfort. Firstly, at the start of verse 9, it's Jesus speaking, and he says, I know the tribulation, your poverty, etc. They're not suffering because Jesus has taken his eye off the ball or stopped paying attention to them. Jesus knows. He sees it. I'll come back to that in a moment, but Jesus knows. Secondly, the first half of verse 10, they're told why some of them are going to be thrown in jail. And it's so that you might be tested. That's the words that he uses. And let's be clear, it's the devil who's doing this. He's the active agent trying to persecute God's people here. But God is turning this to his purposes, that it becomes a test. And also you notice that it's limited. For 10 days they'll have tribulation. Now it could be a literal 10 days, or John often uses symbolic numbers to mean maybe 10, meaning a magnitude of time. But regardless, it's limited. And that should tell us that the devil's power is limited. Perhaps it makes us think of 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, where we're told that trials can prove and strengthen and grow the faith of Christians to the praise of God's glory. So even verses 9 and 10, the most dramatic and maybe awful things to hear for this church, there is some comfort. Some of us may feel that we have strength and resolve in our own ability, in our own personalities, that we're strong enough to withstand and not be afraid and be faithful unto death. Maybe like Peter, when Jesus tells him he's about to die, and Peter's like, I'm going to die with you. We maybe think we have a bit of bravado. But more of us, I think, would feel worried. I'm not sure I'm that tough. I don't know if my resolve is that strong. How could the Christians in Smyrna, and how could I be able to be faithful rather than fearful? Well, the real impact and the real comfort comes from the verses either side of what we've been looking at so far. Verses 8 and then the second half of verse 10 into 11. Who is the one speaking these words to the angel in Smyrna, to the church? Well, verse 8 tells us, the words of the first and the last, who died and came back to life. This church are facing suffering and they are facing death, but the one who is speaking to them is the one who has faced both and come out victorious. Bears are pretty scary, aren't they? They have huge teeth, unbelievable strength, vicious claws. We would be toast if we came face to face with a bear. That's how we feel in the face of suffering and death. What on earth can we do in the face of those enemies? But we have Jesus Christ, the one who's defeated death and sin. And so we're not going toe-to-toe with a live bear. It's more like we're just walking past a stuffed one at a museum. It's a defeated enemy. Dead, defeated. Victory has been won already by Jesus. So there's no real danger anymore. There's no real threat. We can genuinely not fear suffering and persecution and death because we listen to the one who died and came back to life. It gets better as we go into the second half of verse 10 and into 11. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. And this is truly remarkable. The gift that we receive, if we receive Jesus by faith, is that crown of life, eternal life. It means we are given invincibility against the second death. The second death is referring to that eternal separation and that facing of the judgment of God. But if we have Jesus, then that second death cannot touch us. Our future, therefore, is guaranteed, even though we receive tribulation in this life. And we may be like the church in Smyrna, in poverty, or in tribulation, or in facing slander. That reminder is in verse 9. Yet we are rich, because in Jesus we have the one who has beaten sin and death. That is our guarantee. Only in him can we not fear, and only in him can we be faithful unto death. And these are beautiful truths, ones that we dearly need, both in the coming years and especially now. So I hope you have a really helpful time meditating on this, and I pray that it'll be a blessing to think about these promises that we've heard from the lips of Jesus.